Imagine standing in Egypt, but forget the pyramids, forget the pharaohs, forget the golden masks and giant temples, because we're going back much, much further to a time before ancient Egyptian civilization even existed. A time when humans were living along the Nile, while much of the world was locked inside the Ice Age. There were no cities, no pyramids, no massive stone temples, no organized Egyptian kingdom. Instead, there were small groups of prehistoric humans trying to survive in a landscape that could change dramatically from one season to another. And here's the strange part: when most people hear the words Ice Age, they imagine an endless frozen wasteland. But Egypt wasn't covered by a giant sheet of ice. The real challenge was something very different: water, food, changing rivers, extreme landscapes, and an environment that could become incredibly difficult to survive in. So, how did prehistoric humans living in the region of modern Egypt survive? And what did they actually do to stay alive? Let's go back tens of thousands of years, before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before Egypt became one of the world's greatest civilizations. And let's begin with the one thing that made survival possible: the Nile. For prehistoric people living in northeastern Africa, the Nile was more than just a river, it was a lifeline. Water could mean the difference between life and death. Animals gathered around water. Fish lived in the river. Plants could grow near the water, and the surrounding landscape could provide opportunities for hunting and gathering. But surviving beside the Nile wasn't as simple as just walking down to the river and drinking. The climate was constantly changing. During the late Pleistocene, much of the Sahara was extremely dry. Some areas that look like empty desert today were difficult environments for humans to live in. And this meant prehistoric communities had to follow resources. They couldn't simply build a permanent home and assume the environment would always provide for them. Instead, they had to move. They hunted. They gathered. They fished. And they used whatever resources the landscape offered. Archaeological evidence from the Nile Valley shows that prehistoric humans were already developing specialized stone tool technologies. One remarkable example is Nazlet Khater in Upper Egypt. Archaeologists discovered evidence of a chert mining site dating to roughly 33,000 years ago. Think about that. 33,000 years ago, humans were not simply wandering around randomly. They were deliberately extracting stone from the ground. They knew which materials they needed, they knew where to find them, and they knew how to turn those materials into useful tools. That tells us something important. These people were skilled survivors, but tools were only part of the equation. They also needed food. And this is where the Nile became extremely important. Imagine waking up thousands of years ago beside the river. You don't have a refrigerator, you don't have a supermarket, you don't have a farm producing food year round. Every meal has to come from the environment. Fish could provide food, wild animals could be hunted. Plants, seeds, roots, and other edible resources could be collected when available. And prehistoric humans became experts at using multiple food sources instead of depending on just one. That was critical, because if one source disappeared, another might still be available. But there was another problem: the environment didn't always stay the same. During different periods, the Nile Valley and surrounding regions experienced major climatic changes. Rainfall patterns shifted, river conditions changed, and parts of the Sahara could become wetter or drier. At certain times, northern Africa became much greener than the desert landscape we know today. But at other times, the environment became far harsher. For humans trying to survive, that meant one thing: adapt or disappear. And prehistoric humans adapted. They changed where they lived. They changed what they hunted. They changed how they used the landscape. And they developed different technologies. One of the most fascinating examples comes from Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley. The site contains human remains dating to roughly 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. And the evidence tells a disturbing story. Many of the individuals had injuries consistent with repeated episodes of interpersonal violence. In other words, life wasn't always peaceful. These people weren't only fighting nature, sometimes they were fighting each other. Why? Scientists have suggested that environmental stress may have played a role. When resources become harder to obtain, competition can increase. Imagine several groups depending on the same limited areas for food and water: a river, a hunting ground, a fishing location, a place where resources are concentrated. When the environment becomes unstable, those resources become even more valuable. And suddenly, Survival isn't just about finding food, it's also about protecting access to it. But prehistoric humans had another advantage. They were incredibly mobile. If one location became difficult, they could move. This was completely different from the later world of cities and permanent settlements. A prehistoric hunter gatherer didn't need to stay in one place forever. The landscape itself became their map. They knew where animals moved, they knew where water could be found, they knew where useful plants grew, they knew which places were safer during certain seasons, and that knowledge could be passed from one generation to another. Think about how powerful that would be. A child growing up in this environment wasn't simply learning how to speak. They were learning how to survive. Which plants could be eaten, which animals were dangerous, where water could be found, how to make stone tools, how to hunt, how to move through the landscape, and when to leave. This knowledge was essentially their survival technology. There was no written survival manual, no GPS, no weather forecast, no emergency service. Their knowledge had to live inside their minds, and one mistake could be deadly. But here's something even more interesting. The people living in prehistoric Egypt weren't simply surviving in isolation, they were part of a much larger human story. Across Africa and Eurasia, human populations were adapting to changing environments. Some lived in deserts, some lived beside rivers, some hunted large animals, others relied heavily on fishing and gathering. And over thousands of years, these populations experimented with different ways of living. Eventually, the Ice Age ended. The climate began changing again, and northern Africa experienced a remarkable transformation. The Sahara became much wetter during what scientists call the African Humid Period. Grasslands expanded, lakes appeared in places that are now desert, and human populations began occupying areas that had previously been much more difficult to live in. This created an entirely different world. People could move across landscapes that had once been much drier. Animals spread into new regions, and human communities developed new ways of using the environment. But then, the climate changed again. The African humid period gradually ended. The Sahara became increasingly dry, and people were pushed toward reliable sources of water. One of the most important destinations was the Nile Valley, and this is where the story begins moving toward something familiar: permanent settlements, farming, larger communities, social organization, and eventually, the civilization we know as ancient Egypt. So here's the important distinction. The people living in Egypt during the Ice Age were not ancient Egyptians in the pharaonic sense. They lived thousands of years before the Egyptian kingdoms and pyramids, but they were a part of the much longer human history of the Nile Valley. And without understanding these prehistoric populations, we miss an important part of the story of how humans eventually built civilization there. The pyramids didn't appear out of nowhere. Civilization didn't suddenly begin one morning. It was the result of thousands of years of people learning how to survive, how to use the Nile, how to exploit their environment, how to cooperate, how to adapt, and how to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. The people who lived along the Nile, tens of thousands of years ago, had none of the technology we take for granted. No electricity, no engines, no medicine like ours, no modern buildings, no machines. And yet, they survived. They survived environmental changes. They survived periods of extreme dryness. They survived dangerous animals. They survived hunger. And sometimes, they survived conflict with other humans. Their greatest weapon wasn't a machine. It wasn't a modern invention. It was knowledge. Knowing where to find water. Knowing what to eat. Knowing how to hunt. Knowing how to make tools. Knowing when to move. And knowing how to survive when the environment changed. Thousands of years later, that accumulated knowledge would become part of the much larger story of human settlement along the Nile. And eventually, one of the greatest civilizations in human history would rise there. The pyramids would be built, pharaohs would rule, temples would dominate the landscape, and Egypt would become legendary. But long before all of that, there were ordinary humans standing beside the Nile, watching the landscape, searching for food, making stone tools, and trying to survive another day. They didn't know they were living in a chapter of history. They were simply trying to stay alive. And that's what makes their story so incredible. Because sometimes, the most important part of history isn't the king, or the monument, or the empire. It's the ordinary human being who survived long enough to make everything that came afterward possible.